water and salt according to the physiological state, our physiological state. And you remember from last time that what happens is that the activity of the long loops of Henle and the juxtamedullary loops of Henle, the pumping out of the sodium and the diffusion of the sodium and the diffusion of the water, the activity of the pumps in this long loop here sets up this gradient in the background of the medulla, which goes from approximately 300 down to about, at its peak, about 1200 milliosmoles. And the activity of the loop of Henle in doing this is reinforced by what's going on in the vasorector to set this up. And what this does is it sets up the conditions so that when the filtrate comes down the collecting duct and back through the medulla, the collecting duct can either be impermeable to water, in which case you pee out a large volume of dilute urine, or it becomes permeable to water under the influence of this hormone called ADH, which inserts water channels in the membranes of these cells, and then these cells can see the osmotic gradient between what's inside and what's outside, and water diffuses out, and you only pee out small quantities of high concentrated urine. That was basically what I talked about last time. And so I want to continue on with that, talking a bit more about ADH, and then in the second half today, move on to some of the other hormones that are involved in the function of the kidney, because the kidney is a target for the activity of several different hormones. And although you'll be doing that in endocrinology, I want to touch on them here as they relate to the function of the kidney. ADH. Now, I found this picture in one of the textbooks, not your textbook, but I thought it was quite interesting because what it shows you is the different regions of or the different segments of the nephron: proximal tubule, loop of Henle, distal tubule, cortical collecting duct, medullary collecting duct, and then the urine that comes out. And what it does is it traces the relative concentration of filtrate in different segments of the nephron as you go down the nephron. So if you look at the conditions of water restriction, in other words, you are dehydrated, so you do not want to lose large quantities of water in the urine, this is what the curve looks like. It goes down the proximal tubule, it goes down the length of the loop of Henle and increases in concentration, and then back again. Remember, there's little net difference between what goes into the loop of Henle and what comes out. And then gradually the concentration increases, and then because of the presence of ADH in the circulation, the collecting duct becomes permeable to water, permeable to water, and so you don't pee out much water. The water you pee out is very little, and the urine becomes very concentrated. So that's what happens. That's what we talked about last time in the conditions of dehydration when you have ADH present. When you are well hydrated and you've been drinking a lot of water or other fluid with a large water content, so you can see what happens here. There is a peak in the loop of Henle, and then there is no reabsorption of water here, and you pee out this is large quantities of dilute urine. So here is the difference here, a very large difference in the osmolality of urine under these two different conditions here. You'll notice that there's a slight difference, or not a slight difference, but there's a difference in what's going on in the loop of Henle under conditions of dehydration and good hydration. And this reflects the fact that actually the pumping in the loop of Henle changes under these two conditions. And so, whereas in conditions of dehydration, that gradient that we've been talking about here goes from about 300 to 12 or even 1400. When you are well hydrated, that gradient is much less marked, and in fact only goes from about 300 to 500 or 600. So actually the pumping in the loop of Henle is sensitive to your state of hydration, and that varies the gradient, so that also helps to modify the concentration of urine that you produce at the end. So that's why that peak is smaller here than it is here. So that's just what happens there. So here we go. This is the same picture again, or another different version of it. Here is the filtrate coming in. Here is the gradient in the background. See, it goes from pale to dark, 300 to 1200. So here is the filtrate. It goes to 1200, then comes back out again, and then goes down the distal tubule. And this is in the presence of ADH. There, ADH present. And so the water is able to come out, and you produce a small volume of high concentrated urine. So that's that situation. Notice here that it causes ADH vasopressin, and we talked about that last time. Vasopressin is the same as ADH. So vasopressin is present, distal and collecting tubules permeable to water. We talked about that, and there's ADH present. ADH absent, then these red lines here along the side of the tubule indicate that this portion of the tubule is impermeable to water because there's no ADH, vasopressin, and the distal and collecting tubules are impermeable to water. They can't see this gradient here, and so the water just comes straight out without the urine being concentrated, and you get a large volume of dilute urine, no water reabsorbed in the distal portion of the nephron, excess water is eliminated. So these are two nice pictures summarizing what we've been talking about. ADH absent. Right. I did mention last time and the time before a little bit about urea. I don't want to focus too much on urea, but urea is a waste substance. It's a product of metabolism of proteins, pretty mostly, because it's high in nitrogen. And as I've said before, we eliminate about half. The clearance of urea is about 50%, and the rest of it is kept in the kidney and reinforces the gradient in the medulla. So that's what this says here. A few things about urea excretion, so that I don't completely ignore it, because it's important. It contributes to the osmotic gradient. It's highly concentrated in the medulla because it's recycled, leaves the collecting ducts and diffuses into the interstitial fluid. It's involved in the loop of Henle, recycling. And it's affected by ADH levels because of the presence of water. So this is the picture showing you what is called urea recycling. I don't want to put a whole lot of emphasis on this. The main part is what we've talked about, but it is significant. So, so I didn't put it in here. So here is 100% of the urea is filtered. And then it's about 50% of it is reabsorbed. It's secreted in the process of the loop recycling process. Comes back here, some more is reabsorbed, and about 55% overall is reabsorbed, and varying amounts can be excreted. So I'm not going to put a whole lot of emphasis on this. I don't need you to remember these numbers here. But the concept, you need to know the concept that the urea recycling is important in kidney function. We don't eliminate all of it, even though it is a waste product. And we keep it in the kidney to help with the medullary gradient. So I showed these pictures before, I believe. No, I didn't. No, I didn't. I showed something similar before. But these are nice summary pictures. I'm not going to go through them in detail here, but there's summary 1 and summary 2. And what they show is what is going on in terms of reabsorption and secretion in different regions of the kidney, different segments of the kidney tubule. So here is the proximal tubule, this bit here. Remember, about 65% or more of reabsorption is happening here. And so here is a proximal tubule cell, and sodium, chloride, bicarbonate, potassium, water, glucose, amino acids are all reabsorbed here, large amount of reabsorption, and a certain amount of secretion. Here is the thin descending limb of the loop of Henle with water coming out. The thick ascending limb with reabsorption of sodium and chloride, which is important here. Reabsorption of sodium and chloride. So that's going on there. So you can have a look at this. This is a summary of what's going on segment by segment. And here, the early distal tubule here with some reabsorption of sodium chloride, calcium, magnesium. Talk a bit about calcium in the next class, actually. And then the later distal tubule. The later distal tubule is interesting because there's more than one kind of cell there. Now I'm going to come back to this next time. We haven't talked about that. But in the late distal tubule, things get even more complicated because there's more than one kind of cell present. Look, there's cells labeled principal cells, and there's cells labeled intercalated cells. And each of them do something different. And I'm going to come back and mention that again. I know I haven't talked about it yet, but I will do. So we're not quite finished with all this stuff yet. And here is the medullary collecting duct and what's going on here. And you can see in the presence of ADH, water is reabsorbed. And also here in these cells, in the presence of ADH, water is reabsorbed. So that's quite an interesting, useful little summary of what's going on in the different segments. Now then, are there any questions about that? Because what I'd like to do next is focus a little bit more on ADH. Because what we've said is that whether you can or not you can produce a concentrated urine depends on whether you've got ADH or not. Well, that just shoves the onus onto ADH. What controls ADH? So that's what I want to talk about next, and it sort of overlaps with endocrinology, but that's okay. Is that a question there?
I was wondering if it's the collecting duct that's most responsible for water diversion, or like the counter-current mechanism. Like, I guess the counter-current is not much net reabsorption of water, or?
I'm sorry, are you talking about this and this here? No.
No,
you want to go back to the previous slide?
The vasorecta compared to the collecting duct, which determines whether the water's the urine is going to be more densely concentrated. It's ADH in the collecting duct.
It's ADH in the collecting duct.
Is the vasorecta for the water reabsorption? Is there much water reabsorption?
No. The vasorecta is an adjunct to what's going on in the loop of Henle in setting up the gradient. Yeah. That's right. That's right. So the collecting duct is an ADH in the collecting duct determines whether or not you produce a concentrated urine in response to the gradient which is set up by the loop of Henle and the vasorecta. Yeah? Okay, good. All right, now let's have a look at the kidney as a target for different hormones. And there's a variety of different hormones that are that target the kidney. The first one is ADH. I'm going to say a bit more about that now. Here's another one, important one, aldosterone. When you do endocrinology, you have a whole class on aldosterone. So we need to talk about it here as well. Here's another one which we'll talk about today, ANP, sometimes called ANF. I'll talk about that. And this PTH stands for parathyroid hormone. It comes from here, the parathyroid glands, and it has to do with calcium. We haven't talked about calcium, but the kidney is largely responsible for whether you pee out calcium or not. And so obviously that's a very important thing. I may not have time to talk about PTH today. If not, we'll talk about it at the beginning of the next class. But these three here, you could put a circle around these three here, because these three all work together. So we'll certainly talk about these today as one group here, and PTH is something slightly separate. So let's lump these three together, ADH, aldosterone, and ANP, because the renal response to these three, ADH, aldosterone, and ANP, is integrated. You know what that means? They work together. These three hormones work together on the kidney to provide control over body fluid volume, electrolyte balance, and acid-base balance. So these three are intimately interconnected. You really can't talk about one without the other, but we do. You've got to separate them out. So I'm going to talk about these three now and how they work together, and then PTH, separate issue, may have to leave that till next time. Are you okay with that? So ADH, we've talked about ADH. I want to focus on the mechanisms of how it works now. I don't need to go through this. This is just the same picture as before, with ADH controlling the water that is reabsorbed in the collecting duct. So I showed you this picture last time. ADH comes from the posterior pituitary gland. It's actually a very interesting hormone. It's only a small molecule. Only has 8 amino acids in it, and you'll deal with this when you come to endocrinology. But it's actually made in the brain. So this is the base of the brain, a region of the brain called the hypothalamus. And hanging off the bottom of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. It's right in the middle of your head. And they're about the size of a pea. At the base of the brain. Very difficult to get to for surgeons and people like that to actually have to do something with that. So here is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is in 2 halves. You can just sit back and listen here, because you're going to come back and do this properly later in the term. The pituitary gland is in 2 halves, called the anterior pituitary, shown here in pink, and the posterior pituitary, which, as you can see, is a continuation of the base of the brain. And what happens is that the ADH here, with the blue dots, is made in a set of neurons, the base of the brain, in the hypothalamus here, called the supraoptic nucleus. This will come back again, don't worry about it. And the ADH then, the hormone, is passed down these neurons and stored in the posterior pituitary gland. This is called neurosecretion. It's nerve cells that make, in this case, hormones and secrete them. Neurosecretion. So here they are, the hormones coming down the nerve axons, and they're secreted into the blood supply of the posterior pituitary gland. And so there it is, leaving, or goes around the whole circulation, of course. And the only cells that are going to respond to this hormone are the ones with receptors for it, exactly. The only cells that can respond are the ones with receptors for it. And we're going to talk about the receptors for it in the kidney. So that's where the ADH is produced, in the base of the brain, the hypothalamus, in nerve cells, passed down to the posterior pituitary gland, which is an extension of the brain, and then into the circulation. Vasopressin closely related to another hormone called oxytocin, which I'm not going to talk about, but you'll get later on in the term, which is produced very close by in the hypothalamus and is also passed down to the circulation in the posterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary, although they're stuck together, is almost like a separate gland altogether. And the anterior pituitary produces a whole slew of hormones, which we're not going to talk about today. All right? So, antidiuretic hormone then is involved in osmoregulation, increases water reabsorption by the kidney, we know that already. In the absence of ADH, if you don't have ADH, the distal tubules and collecting ducts are almost totally impermeable to water, resulting in extreme water loss in the urine. And there's a disease in which people don't have antidiuretic hormone. It's called diabetes insipidus. And these people pee out buckets of water every day. They're drinking constantly and peeing constantly. Buckets and buckets of water. Very dilute urine. Diabetes is the same word as diabetes and the pancreas and glucose. And what the word diabetes means to flow. And it has to do with the fact that you pee a lot. So you pee a lot in diabetes insipidus because you don't have ADH. You also pee a lot if you have diabetes mellitus, the classic diabetes. And the reason for that is that you're peeing out large amount of glucose. Do you remember that? You've got glucoseuria. You've exceeded the renal threshold for glucose. And when you pee out glucose, you also osmotically draw out water. So if you have classical diabetes mellitus, you pee a lot too. So that's why they're both called diabetes, but actually they have absolutely no relation to each other. Diabetes mellitus is glucose. Melli, what does melli mean? Anybody know? Greek, huh? Sweet, yes. And how do people know that? That it's sweet? They tasted it. Diabetes insipidus that we're talking about because of the lack of ADH, diabetes, what does insipid mean?
Bitter.
Huh?
Bitter.
Second.
Bitter.
Bitter? No, not bitter. Not bitter, no. Insipid. Tasteless. If your food is insipid, you put loads of salt on it to give it some flavor. Insipid means tasteless. How did they know it was tasteless? They tasted it. So, diabetes mellitus, the pea is sweet, lots of it. Diabetes insipidus, the pea is tasteless. It's not salty the way normal pea would be. And so, large amounts of tasteless, not salty pea. So that's, we know why that is. Diabetes insipidus. This will come back again. Mellitus when you do the pancreas, insipidus when you do the posterior pituitary gland. So it's produced in neurons of the supraoptic nucleus, which acts as osmoreceptors. So that's where your body determines whether you're dehydrated or not. Osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. If you're dehydrated, you produce lots of ADH, so you don't pee. Normally, the renal excretion of water is constantly under the control of ADH, and as we know, it alters the permeability of the luminal membrane of the collecting ducts by putting into the membrane pores that water can move through. And they're called aquaporins. For once in your life, the name tells you exactly what it does. Aquaporins, water pores. And so here is what's going on. The osmoreceptors in the brain sense that the body fluids are dehydrated. The cells of the supraoptic nucleus produce ADH, goes down the nerve tracts to the posterior pituitary gland, into the circulation. The only cells that can respond are the cells with the receptors for it. And here is a collecting duct epithelium here. So here is the lumen, this is where the filtrate is, here is the blood. So in the blood is ADH coming from the pituitary gland, here it is here. The only cells that can respond are the ones with receptors, and bingo, the collecting duct epithelium have ADH receptors. And you've seen what happens next before. This is the cyclic AMP second messenger system. ADP, TP goes to cyclic AMP, and I hope you know about cyclic AMP. This is that magic substance that revs up the biochemistry of the cells in which it is present. So in these cells, the cyclic AMP revs up protein kinases, causes protein phosphorylation, and then, not sure, and makes aquaporins, which are inserted into membrane vesicles in the cytoplasm. And so you have vesicles with these water channels in them, and when you need them, these fuse with the plasma membrane on the luminal side, and these water channels, these aquaporins, get inserted into the membrane here, and water then can be reabsorbed. So you lose water from the lumen, that's water reabsorption under the influence of ADH and the insertion of these aquaporins into the membrane. So the aquaporins, AQPs for short, big area of modern research in membrane channel physiology and biochemistry. A lot being known about these. There are a whole bunch of them, as usual. This is a family of proteins. It's a gene family, and there are, I don't know how many there are now. There are at least 4 AQPs, and my guess is that by now there's a lot more. I'm sure this is one of those gene families that increases every year. And so aquaporin 1 is in the proximal tubule. There's some of them in there. Aquaporins 2, 3, and 4 are in the collecting ducts. The one that we're primarily talking about under the influence of ADH is aquaporin 2. So that's the molecule primarily responsible for the ADH regulated water permeability, and ADH regulates the transcription of the AQP2 gene and then enables the cell to produce the AQP2, insert it into these vesicles in the cytoplasm, which are then fused with the plasma membrane, and AQP2 channels appear on the luminal surface of the cells. So abnormal water loss and retention can be associated with abnormal AQP expression. So in other words, there can be genetic diseases in which you don't produce the AQP2 properly. And that's one cause of diabetes insipidus. There are other causes of diabetes insipidus. For example, if you don't have the receptor for ADH, then you can't do this, and so you have loads of water. But you'll talk about that later in endocrinology. So that's the story of ADH and its effect on aquaporins and how the water reabsorption responds to dehydration. Here, this is the same thing. A nice little picture here. This is where you start over here with ADP. ADP. What's ADP? Vasopressin. Yeah. Sometimes called arginine vasopressin. Dr. Harvey will explain that later in the term. So this is ADP, arginine vasopressin. You can just put ADH there. ADH attaching to its receptor. It's the whole story, usual story, the G proteins, adenylate cyclase, cyclic AMP, protein kinases. This stimulates the transcription and translation of the AQP2 gene here, which inserts the channels into the vesicles here, and by exocytosis they appear on the surface, or the luminal surface is the luminal surface of the tubule cells. And so this is, you've come across this before, I hope. So that's quite a nice picture. It shows you in molecular terms what the ADH is doing over here and how it is responsible for the presence of water channels in the collecting duct luminal membrane. So let's come back to the physiology then. When you get dehydrated, you feel thirsty. Well, that's happy, isn't it? You feel thirsty, you reach for a drink, you drink. So there's a whole physiology associated with thirst and how your response to dehydration is to drink water, which is what you want. And so here's a little flow chart which sort of talks about that. If you lose water, you're sweating heavily, you become dehydrated, your body fluids become concentrated. This is sensed by the osmoreceptors in the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, produces ADH, goes to the kidney, reabsorb water. We know all about that. And then you dilute the body fluids, and then so there's negative feedback, which switches off the osmoreceptors of the supraoptic nucleus. But there's one other thing on here, and that is that stimulating the supraoptic nucleus here by dehydration causes you to feel thirsty. And you drink, and so there's a thirst center. There's a center for everything, isn't there? There's a thirst center in the brain, which is stimulated by dehydration. And so, you know, a flowchart on thirst. So, you might get a feeling here that there's more to this than meets the eye, and more to this than I'm telling you about. And you'd be right, of course. You know, you could do a term paper on thirst. It'd be a great term paper because there's a big literature on thirst. And so this is just a rough idea of what's involved. You know, your plasma volume, you're dehydrated, your plasma volume's going down. This affects baroreceptors in the circulation. Our friend angiotensin gets involved, somehow stimulates thirst. It affects osmoreceptors in the brain, which stimulates thirst. The baroreceptor stimulates thirst. Your dry mouth and throat stimulates thirst. And there's something else going on that we don't understand either. So look, there's a lot of, there's not a lot of question marks. There's one question mark on here, but in fact there's a lot that we don't understand about thirst. Think about thirst. You get hot and sweaty and thirsty, and you drink. And as soon as you drink, you forget about your thirst. Well, and that happens very quickly, within seconds really. You drink and you go, oh, that's bad. But that's much too quick for the water to get into the stomach, into the small intestine, be reabsorbed, dilute the body fluids, get to the brain, turn off the osmoreceptors, turn off the... Your thirst is relieved much more quickly than than it should be, because of all that's got to happen after you drink. So there's some, you can put a big question mark here, because in some way the intake of water into the GI tract, the stomach and the small intestine, relieves the thirst. Just drinking water does it. It doesn't have to go through the whole thing and turn off the cells of the supraoptic nucleus. You see what I'm getting at here? I mean, as soon as you drink, that's it, you're done. And yet, your body fluids take a while to dilute. So just simply drinking turns off the thirst mechanism. Don't know how that works. So, you know, I bring these things up because physiology is complicated. There's a lot of interacting things going on here. Cardiovascular system, the GI system, the endocrinology, renal physiology. This picture here represents a huge amount of physiology, and we haven't got time to go into it, and we don't understand it all anyway. So just a little taste of something that that's important. So here's another one of these flow charts you can work through on your own, but it's quite straightforward. Here you are, you drink a lot of water, your body fluid osmolarity goes down. This reduces the firing of the osmoreceptors in the base of the brain. This turns off vasopressin secretion. So your vasopressin, ADH in the blood goes down. This turns off the tubular permeability in the water. You reduce water reabsorption, you pee a lot. So that then is the response to drinking large amounts of beer, you pee a lot. And so that's what has to happen in order for that process to go on via the brain and the kidney. Here's another one. Look, we're getting into integrative physiology here, integrating various physiology systems, because if you reduce the plasma volume, you reduce venous, atrial, and arterial pressure. So you become dehydrated, you reduce all of these pressures here. You've got all of these cardiovascular receptors that are monitoring this as well. And this also affects the posterior pituitary gland, increases ADH, increases reabsorption, decreases water reabsorption. So we get a feeling now for how the kidney is integrated with the cardiovascular system. And we haven't even talked about how the kidney is integrated with the respiratory system, and that has to do with acid-base balance. So the renal physiology is a very integrative area of physiology, and it brings together lots of different topics. So here you go. You might have experienced this. This is common everyday experience. When you have increased ADH, you pee less, and different conditions cause this. You know, you go over to the Butterdome. How many students are there writing exams? 1,000? I don't know, thousands of them. And 3-hour exams, how many people in 3 hours get up and go to the bathroom? Not many. You do? Yeah.
I did for the physio one. I did for the physio one.
Not many people. I always think there's 1,000 people here for 3 hours, and maybe 3 or 4 want to go to the bathroom. That's not a coincidence. It's the stress of the exam is changing your ADH level. The stress of the exam, here it is, stress, shock and pain, warm environment, nicotine, smoking, and of course dehydration make you pee less because they change your ADH levels. Here, you pee more when ADH is down, and so alcohol, this would mean vodka, scotch, rum, the alcohol, spirit drinks, make you pee more. I'm not talking about drinking beer here, because if you're drinking beer, you're drinking alcohol, but huge amounts of water. So I'm just talking about the alcohol aspect of it. And so if you're drinking hard drinks and beer for that matter, and smoking at the same time, these are having opposite effects on your ADH levels. So a big screw up there. Yeah.
I thought that nicotine stimulated interference receptors in your GI tract and urinary tract actually made you roll up to the back.
You're doing pharmacology?
Yeah.
Okay, well then, the pharmacologists are much more experts on this than I am. I mean, all of these drugs have complicated interactions. Believe the pharmacologists. They got it down. I'm not a pharmacologist. So yeah, this is a very simplified thing. You know, you go out on a cold day, so let's go down Horlick Park and skate. You just get your skates on, you go out on the ice, you think, oh, I've got to go to the bathroom. Again, that's not a coincidence, it's because the cold decreases your ADH and you produce more urine. Okay, here's a slide on diabetes insipidus. Don't have to spend long on this because we've already touched on it. Due to a lack of ADH, you can't concentrate the urine. You produce large quantities of dilute urine, usually caused by a tumor, which destroys parts of the hypothalamus, so you're no longer able to produce ADH. But it can be due to a lack of receptors for ADH in the kidney. So you've got normal ADH, but you can't respond to it. Fortunately, ADH is a relatively simple molecule, and you'll look at that later on in the term, so you can make it quite easily and produce it. Okay, bye. All right, now I said that there are 2 other hormones involved here. which are combined with the effects of ADH, and one of them comes from the adrenal gland. So here's the adrenal gland, here are our kidneys here is the adrenal gland sitting on top of it. It's a complex gland, and you'll look at that later on in the term. Adrenal means close to the kidney, and so the adrenal gland, what's going on here? Exams or something?
Yes.
Okay.
What, guys?
So aldosterone is a steroid hormone from the adrenal glands, and its main target is the kidney. We're going to talk about aldosterone and what it is and where it comes from and how it's controlled. All we're concerned with here is that it increases sodium reabsorption by the distal tubules and collecting ducts. So it regulates sodium loss in the urine, and therefore, because it regulates sodium loss, it also regulates water loss. So hey, all I've been talking about is ADH, but there's other hormones that affect it as well. In this case, indirectly through its effect on sodium and chloride. And you know that there are osmotic results of changing sodium and chloride concentrations which affect water. So we have to try and put aldosterone into the picture together with ADH. And it affects chloride, potassium, and hydrogen ions, which you'll talk about. So here is just a quick doodle on what aldosterone is doing. Here is the distal tubule and collecting duct. Under the influence of aldosterone, sodium and chloride are reabsorbed, and potassium and hydrogen are secreted. So what does that do? Well, it affects water. It affects the amount of sodium and chloride in water that you retain in the body. Aldosterone, good Lord, what is this exam? Who? Bio 207. Really? It's really that important? All right. Aldosterone is a hormone that's essential for life. You don't have aldosterone, you lose so much sodium that you die. So aldosterone, of course, has to be carefully regulated. And it's regulated by this system called the renin-angiotensin system. Have you, we talked about this before. Have you done renin-angiotensin in other places? Some yes, some no? No? So here is the renin-angiotensin system that regulates aldosterone secretion. Here is angiotensinogen in the blood. The kidneys secrete this enzyme called renin, which converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, which is then changed by a converting enzyme into angiotensin 2, which has a whole slew of effects in the body. It's a vasoconstrictor, not shown here, it's a vasoconstrictor, but it also goes to the adrenal cortex, and the adrenal cortex secretes aldosterone. So this is the renin-angiotensin system, which is one of the control mechanisms for this hormone called aldosterone. So this picture, I know it looks tough, but I really like it. I really like it, and I'll explain to you why. So this is the renin-angiotensin system, and shows the effect, how the effects of aldosterone and ADH are integrated. Look, here is angiotensinogen coming from the liver. Here is renin coming from the kidney. You know where that comes from, the juxtaglomerular apparatus, which causes the formation of angiotensin. Here is this converting enzyme, which converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. It comes from the lungs, for heaven's sakes. And angiotensin 2, as I just said, has lots of different effects. One of them is to go to the adrenal cortex and cause the secretion of aldosterone. And aldosterone goes to the kidney, and it causes increased sodium reabsorption by the kidney and affects the sodium balance and the amount of sodium that you keep and how much sodium you pee out. So look what's going on here. The livers, the kidney, the lungs, the adrenal cortex, kidney again. It'll blow you away. So I love this picture. I think this is great. Follow it through. Start here on here and follow how all these different factors come in to have the aldosterone affecting sodium reabsorption by the kidney and correcting the sodium excretion and therefore water excretion. But look, there's more. The angiotensin II, I said, has lots of different effects. Doesn't just affect the adrenal cortex. It affects vasopressin, that's ADH. It affects thirst, and it affects arteriolar vasoconstriction. So angiotensin II does at least four different things, all of which correct the initial problem. Wow. This is real physiology. If you do one thing over the weekend, have a look at this slide and see if you can figure it out and see how wonderful it is.
I wouldn't be surprised if he has a life frame.
This is the same thing. While you're looking at that over the weekend, have a look at this one too. It's the same slide. And this one. And this one. So this is the way in which what these do is they show you the way in which aldosterone and ADH work together. So I give you these to work through. Here you're sweating and you become dehydrated. It affects your plasma volume and plasma osmolarity and affects aldosterone, which affects sodium excretion, and this affects vasopressin or ADH, which affects water excretion. So this is putting together aldosterone and ADH in response to dehydration. Potassium also affects aldosterone. And I'm going to finish today with another hormone, last couple of minutes, and this one is called atrial natriuretic factor. This tells you all you need to know. Atrial, where does it come from?
The heart?
The heart comes from the atrium. Holy moly, who knew? The heart secretes a hormone. The atrium contains cells which, when they are stretched, secrete a hormone called atrial natriuretic factor or peptide. And natriuretic, natri, what's natri? Na? Sodium, natri, anything with natri in it is sodium. Natriuretic, sodium in the urine. So you've got a hormone that affects sodium in the urine, natriuretic, and it's atrial, so it comes from the heart. It's an easy name if you understand the origin of these words. Atrial natriuretic factor. It comes from cells of the right atrium. When you're overhydrated, you've been drinking beer all night long, your blood volume goes up and it stretches the heart more than usual. And when it stretches the atrium of the heart releases this factor, and guess what it does? It inhibits sodium reabsorption, inhibits sodium excretion, increases water loss, you pee it out, reduces the volume. It has the opposite effect of aldosterone. This is homeostasis, guys. You've got water and sodium balance that you have to maintain, what you keep and what you lose. Homeostasis, multiple mechanisms. You have ADH, you have thirst, you have aldosterone, you have atrial natriuretic factor, all working together, integrated, to make sure you pee out the right amount of water and sodium, and you keep the right amount of water and sodium. Sorry that last bit's a bit rushed, but those flow charts you can work through on your own, and it'll be interesting and not difficult to do on your own. And there's another one while you're at it.
Oh.